Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Wherever you're joining us from in Australia, I hope that it is not as wet and miserable as it is here in Newcastle at the moment. Look, I just want to start by saying we here at Supporting Potential know that your time is really valuable, and that to give an organisation an hour of your time is a big commitment. So we want to make sure that you are getting value from today. So today's all about our Survive and Thrive series. We know that trying to navigate this current climate is super difficult. So we want to give you the tools that you need to actually navigate what's going to be the changes moving forward, and doing it in a way that not only feels good, but helps you move to a successful position. You can't wait for the storm to shape you. We know that there's a storm coming. Now is your opportunity to make sure that you lay down really strong roots. Before we get started, I do want to make an acknowledgement of country. So the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all gathering on today. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I want to say thank you for being the creators of our storytelling culture that we have here in Australia, because I think that is a really important way that we make sure that, particularly in our space, we learn from others and we can continue to share those stories that actually change and make an impact for people. Some of you may already know who we are at Supporting Potential, but we are NDIS specialists who help senior leaders rethink how they're providing their NDIS supports. We work from a first principles basis in that everything that we want to do should be easy and should be based on your strengths that you already have. We're very passionate in our values, and we work that same way with everybody. We will only work with organisations that are genuinely in this industry for the right reasons to really help make people's lives with disability a better place. So today's webinar is all about change, how we individually manage change, what changes are actually going to be coming for us. I think we would be amiss if we didn't start with the political landscape. So obviously we had an election on Saturday, and it was a landslide by every media's review of that election. What that means for us in the disability sector with the Albanese Labor government staying in power is that we probably have a little bit more consistency. We know exactly what Labor was planning to do in the NDIS space. We know that they are likely to continue along that same pathway. They don't have anything to prove. They don't need to reshuffle things just for the sake of reshuffling. So what we need to understand is that the status quo is probably going to continue. So we understand that Labor's power moves are going to be making the NDIS fairer, easier to navigate, person-centred, and most importantly, they're going to be cracking down on fraud. They have been the key messages from the Labor government for probably the last 12 to 18 months. However, we also know that there's a whole bunch of major reports and initiatives that were due or are still due that theoretically could change things. However, the fact that it is still a Labor government is highly unlikely. So we are still waiting on the NDIS review response, even though we've had legislation changes already. We are still waiting on the National Foundational Support Strategy, which is tabled to start rolling out in July of 2025. But call me a skeptic. I think we're probably going to miss that date. There is the first Disability Royal Commission progress report due in June. And again, I don't know how much forward motion we've actually had on that. The independent hospital, and I'm always going to get this name wrong because I worked for them back when they were IPA, but they are now the Independent Hospital and Aged Care Pricing Authority. They were asked to provide an assessment of the pricing within the NDIS, and I believe that they have their report with government at the moment. And finally, we've got the request for tender that went out for the assessment tool. So that was very clearly based upon evidence base, which I would question is not really there for an assessment-based tool. But these are the key things that are going to probably shift our landscape a little bit. What we also know, though, is that there are some very big functional impacts that are coming for NDIS service providers in the near future. So the NDIS Quality and Safeguard Commission has made it really clear that there will be mandatory registration for SIL, support coordination and platform service providers. Again, that was tabled to start to kick off around July 2025. I, again, may be cynical and say I don't think we'll make that timeline, but I still think it's coming. There is also very strong discussions about the separation of SIL and SDA. Again, not a lot of detail about how that's actually going to happen, but we know it is likely going to happen. We know that they are pushing to strengthen the regulatory powers of the Commission, which probably means more NDIS service providers being taken to civil courts, but they're also pushing for criminal charges against NDIS service providers. They're also looking to increase the penalty for if an NDIS service provider is deemed to be negligent or responsible for a person with disability being harmed. At the moment, it's sitting at $400,000 as the maximum penalty. The proposal is that it goes up to $15 million. We also have areas where we're going to be introducing things like navigators, broader assessment and budgeting co-design, participant pathways, participant safeguarding. The Commission needs to be releasing a summary report for the registration of SIL providers. And we also should be seeing a summary report on the consultation of Bill number 2. So if you didn't think that there was enough going on in the space at the moment, I think that quick little snapshot is enough to show us that there's a lot going on. We also know that internally we have a lot going on too, and I think that that's creating a space where we're all feeling a little bit negative and very, what's the word I want to use? A little bit trigger shy. We know that we've got fight, flight or freeze as our natural responses when things aren't going quite the way that we want them to. We've heard the rhetoric that NDIS is not a viable industry, that organisations are losing money hand over fist, that many organisations are closing. But we also know that organisations have said that they're pushing hard to improve their productivity. They've also said that they want to expand their operations, which I actually think could be detrimental in the current climate. But we're going to get to a little bit more of that coming up. What we need to understand is that we are probably going to continue to be in this space of constant change, lack of certainty. And the truth is we need to work out how we navigate that, because change is going to continue to come at us. Yes, we're tired. Yes, we're sick of it. But realistically, you've got two choices. You either exit the industry or you learn to get comfortable with small but consistent changes, because that's the only way this is going to work. The government is not all of a sudden going to turn around after 13 years and change the rhetoric that providers are dodgy and they're the reason why the NDIS is failing. They're not going to suddenly invite providers to the table. So we need to work out what can we do in our space? What do we have control over? And how do we actually use that control to our advantage? But that actually means we've got to change. We've got to look at what we're doing and we've got to look at how do we readjust. And that can feel really daunting. We know that you don't have all the answers. Nobody in this space has all the answers. They're just not there. But change really does ask us to let go of what's familiar, even when it's no longer serving us. And I think that's sometimes where we get a little bit caught up, is trying to work out, how do we change? Why is this no longer serving us when it did so well before? The real hard truth here, though, is just because there's noise in the market doesn't mean that your organization isn't going to thrive. It's the noise from your leadership is the space where it's going to be really fatal. Decision fatigue, overthinking every move, changing decisions because you're not quite sure if they're right, fixing things that actually are in the remit of somebody within your team, because if you don't do it, it's not going to get done right. They all send really clear messages to our team that we don't feel safe. We don't feel comfortable. But what we also know, though, is standing still is a bigger risk. So this section today is about taking us on a journey of identifying some of the behaviours that you may commonly see in terms of senior leadership in NDIS, where they may be resistant to change. They may be resistant to doing something different. Now, very rarely do people actually come out and say, I don't want to change, or, yeah, I know we've got problems here, but let's just keep doing the same thing and hope that it gets better. Nobody's going to say that. What they say is far more subtle, and we're going to dive into a little bit of that today. But first, we need to understand why we're hesitating. And I think that that comes around from something called the change curve. So the change curve is really talking about understanding what we do and why we do it. Naturally, our human inclination is to maintain the status quo. The status quo feels safe. We know what we can expect. We know what our role is within that status quo. But when we're looking at the status quo, we're also questioning, something doesn't feel right here. I know that it's not great, but we're in denial that we can actually do anything about it. Is this sounding familiar? Then we start to move to frustration. So we start to really question, what the hell is going on? Why isn't this so easy for me as it is for other people? How do we fix it? This then leads to disruption, which is where we tend to be forced to change anyway. The writing's starting to show up on the wall. So we start to do things a little different because we have to. This is where our fight, flight, freeze or fawn responses kick in. So we let go of what we once knew and we start to explore. We start to get curious about what could be. We then start to build our confidence when some of those what could be moments start to pay dividends for us. We then start to get a little bit more excited, go a little bit further in our change approach. But what that generally means is that we also take a few steps back. Nothing is ever a linear journey. It's never just onwards and upwards. There's going to be problems. That's a guarantee. The question is, how do you as the leader respond to those problems? How do you bounce back? How do you rebuild your NDIS business to be powerful? How do you understand what it is your strengths are? What is it your weaknesses are? And how do you make the most out of your strength while minimizing your weakness? So, as we said, change blockers are everywhere. And it's not necessarily that they are intentionally being a change blocker. We're all in this industry. We've all heard it before. All behavior is a form of communication. This even applies to your senior leadership team. It applies to everyone. Let's face it. We're all just big children that have had a lot more life experience and can sometimes handle things a bit better. Sometimes we can't. And when the pressure gets a lot, we all do tend to have some bad behaviors every now and again. It might just be you were short in a response. It might be that you didn't spend as much time on the small talk because you've got too many things to do. But we know that there are certain traits and certain things that we can see when somebody is in a resistant state versus when someone is in a growth-minded state. So the resistant leaders tend to be defensive or dismissive. They might be anxious or highly reactive. They might do things that actually exclude their team because that gives them more control. They might really be working hard to protect the status quo. They might become directive or more vague because they don't know the answers. They can't share that detail if they don't know it. And they'll view compliance as a burden. Whereas our growth-minded leaders, they listen. They ask the questions that they don't know the answers to, and they're okay that they don't know the answers. They plan small tests and pilots. They get curious. They get people involved that know elements of the business that they don't to co-design. They own their mistakes. They look for further opportunities and they're transparent in their communication. So now what you're about to see over the next few pages is we've got 5 different CEOs and organizations. The CEOs that you're about to meet are all fictional. So please don't try and think that we are calling out any particular leader in our industry, but you may see yourself in some of these leaders. You may see someone that you work with in some of these leaders. The thing that I want you to take notice of, though, is that the data that we're presenting against each of these fictional CEOs is actually real data. We've done a fairly significant deep dive over the last 6 months. And we've looked into ACNC data, we've looked into the NDIS payment data, we've looked into the ASIC liquidations data, we've even gone to Glassdoor and Seek to find out if there's a correlation between staff satisfaction scores and profitability. Because let's face facts, whilst most of us are not in this industry because we want to make a lot of money, we do need to make money to stay in this industry. So whilst we can have a lot more other subtle drivers for change, I think what we need to acknowledge is if the finances aren't where we need them to be, that's a sledgehammer that we need to change. That's not subtle. That's not something that we can choose to ignore. So each of our CEOs, and we've got Colin here on the screen right now, each of our CEOs comes with a little story and their history. So Colin is the Legacy Builder CEO. He started his own NDIS organization a gazillion years ago because he had a child with a disability and he wanted something more for that child. You might hear the Legacy Builder say things like, our clients love us. We're like a family here. We can survive anything if we just stick together. I know it's tough, but we've gone through worse than this before. They tend to have a positive focus. But what we can see here is that Colin's organisation is continuing to grow. He's seeing growth year on year. Yes, it's plateaued out a little bit, but he is losing money year on year. So how long can he sustain that for? Colin has to change, but he deeply values loyalty and legacy. So he's going to struggle to get rid of some of his outdated systems and staff that are no longer proving their worth. You get through to a legacy builder by framing change as the opportunity to really protect the legacy. the opportunity to improve outcomes for participants and actually make that legacy even more valuable. That's how you talk to the Collins who are pushing back on change. Next, and I'm sure a lot of us can empathize with Janine here. So Janine's our burnt out operator. Janine has been around and seen all the COVID trials and tribulations and was in the hot seat for making some of those really big decisions that came out. She has been putting out fires left, right, and center. You might hear your Janine burnt out operator say things like, I just need a minute to breathe. Just got to take a second and it'll all be okay. Just, I need a moment. Or, yep, I understand that's a really big issue. We'll get to it once we get past our next audit. That's got to take priority right now. So someone like the burnt out operator, they tend to be all over the detail. They know everything inside and out, but they can't prioritize the strategic reform that's the root cause of a lot of the problems that they're facing day in and day out. Now, Janine's organisation is a little bit more in the firing line than Collins. So not only is Janine losing money 2 years out of 3, but they're actually seeing a very, very big reduction in their growth. So when you're seeing both a reduction in growth and a reduction in profit, you've got fairly big issues that you need to address because your time could be very limited. So how do we talk to the burnout operator? The idea is we want to make short, quick wins. We don't want to labor on the complexity and we don't want to make constant big decisions. This is the 1%ers. This is the space that if you can do lots of little things, just that tiny bit differently and get a slightly better outcome, you are going to change things. So look at how you make decisions within this organisation. Look at how you can better support the Janines that are just overloaded with making decisions day in and day out. Our next one, Naveen. Naveen's the ostrich. So he is running a large support coordination business. They had fairly drastic growth and then they lost a lot of their market share at the same time. He has had plummeting profit margins for the last 3 years. Naveen got specifically hired because he's a lawyer. He knows how to build systems that work, how to pass an audit. These financials do not make sense to him because he knows that he's got everything in place for his organisation to be successful. He will say things like, but we've passed every audit. We know we provide a quality service. No, we don't want to get that consultant in because we'll lose control. He avoids transparency because he doesn't want to know what he doesn't know. He doesn't want to deal with things like organisational cultural issues because there's no right and wrong answer. It's the shades of grey. So he buries his head in the sand. But the way we get the Naveens of the world to listen is that we use benchmarking and position reform to show that we are actually a mature organisation and we just then need to shift in some certain areas to make sure that maturity does actually equal growth and financial longevity. Our next CEO that we are going to meet is Talia. So you've all probably met Talia over LinkedIn. She's very passionate about what she does. She provides psychosocial SIL and community access. Her organisation is very much financially struggling. They are also on a downward growth turn. They've also lost quite a lot of money over the years and continue to get worse year on year. So Talia is in the game because she's a values-first founder. She believes that people with psychosocial disabilities deserve the best in life, and she believes that her support style is really the thing that helps them to live their best life. You might hear Talia saying things like, but you really can't measure what impact our services have, or the NDIS reforms are killing our ability to provide a different type of service. She doesn't believe the government should have any role to play in the care economy because, in her words, they just don't care. But the way you get through to the Talias of the world, you align the organisational reform with her values, using co-design, using trauma-informed practice, and look at what is the flip. How do we take these things that we know we do so well and use them to our advantage? And our final CEO, Craig. So Craig is our detached leader. Craig is running a very, very large service provider across multiple states in multiple different service offerings. So he was appointed by the board because he has a very strong focus on performance and risk metrics. The issue is that Craig likes to sit in his office, and Craig focuses on the data and the information coming in through to him, but he's very disconnected from his front line. He couldn't tell you the name of a single participant within his organisation, but he wants to see better outcomes. And what you'll hear Craig say is things like, but this is a systems issue. They need to fix the price guide. Our model works. We just need better execution on the front line. Craig is the type that will find a reason to blame everything else around without looking at what are the frontline realities. What is the experience felt in the different parts of the business? So, how do you talk to a Craig? You use data. Data is his friend. He likes data. And you myth bust. So you make Craig realise that some of these things are not sector issues. These are organisational issues. You can then use that to drive the connection between culture and financial performance. Now, some of you may be asking, but Craig's right. We do need to look at the price guide. We do need to look at how we're running our financials. The sector is not viable. Well, the next part of our webinar, I'm actually going to challenge some of you because I believe the sector is viable and our data has proven it. So we've done deep dives into 128 NDIS service providers, and we've looked at their performance last financial year, as well as over the last 3 financial years. So the cohort that we've managed to look at provides around $7.3 billion of services, which makes up for nearly 17% of what the sector spent last year. So we're looking at a reasonable proportion. What I think we're seeing here is we know that there was a really large group that are going into liquidation on a regular basis. Now, this sample that you're seeing on your screen right now isn't indicative of the broader sample because we intentionally went and looked for organisations that have gone into liquidation. We wanted to see if there was a concurrent theme between those organisations. There were a lot that went into liquidation this calendar year alone. We're talking about more than 10 a month. So it is a real issue that we need to address. And there wasn't a lot of rhyme and reason between who went into liquidation. I couldn't find very consistent data. But organisations from as little as $1 million right up into a $28 million revenue business have gone into liquidation in 2025. What I think is interesting here, though, is that we can see it's nearly 50-50 on those that have made a loss and those that have made a profit, which is not that dissimilar to what we've heard in some of the other benchmarking studies. It's probably a little bit more on the positive side than what some of the others have made out. But I think what we need to address here is that the market is shifting. We have always said that the NDIS is a new sector. Therefore, it's an immature market and growth reigns supreme. What we're going to see in the next lot of data that we're going to dive into is that perhaps that's no longer the strategy. Perhaps we're now moving into a more mature economy within the NDIS, and many providers that have built their reputation on consistency, compliance, and safe supports, those really big strengths that they had that paid dividends, both when we were state funded and then in the early days of the NDIS, they're actually going to become weaknesses moving forward. We know that when systems, staffing models, and practices simply get repeated because they've worked before, we get to become a little bit blind to what we need to do to continue to be successful. If NDIS providers are not willing to really scrutinize the how and the why that they operate, beyond just ticking boxes, beyond taking the superficial wins like a positive audit report or we made a meager profit, we're going to start to see a lot more providers jumping from the made a profit to the made a loss to the went into liquidation pile. But I'm not saying that just to scare you. We also know that there's some huge positives out there. So in financial year 23-24, and this excludes the organisations that went into liquidation. So our sample made a collective profit of 74 million. Sorry, the extras zeros in there, 740 million. When we look at those that made a profit, so those organisations in our sample that did better than zero, they made 192 million. Those that did less than zero, they lost 117. So what we can see quite clearly here is that some of our organisations are thriving and some are flailing. We can also see the growth curve is not where it should be. So currently, when we look at our data and we look at the accumulation over 3 years, we can see some fairly big trends. So we've got organisations that are just getting richer and richer. So within our data sample, we've got 8 providers that we believe are really high growth potential businesses. They are outperforming everybody else, both on revenue and growth and productivity. These guys are going to be the market leaders. They're going to be the ones that will snap up the ones that are failing. We got about 7 providers that what we think is the really high risk loss space. So they are operating at a loss. Their market share is shrinking year on year. These are going to be the organisations that will close their doors sooner rather than later. But I think it's the middle space that we've really got to address. It's that at-risk middle. So they're not growing fast. They're not making strong profits, but they're just surviving. And I think that's a big part of the sector as a whole at the moment. So in our numbers, that works out to be about 50% are in the survival range, which means that one policy change, or if the NDIS price guide doesn't do what you need it to do, or you get put on a manual payment hold, which delays your cash flow, or you get a big investigation from the commission. All of those things, when we're operating in a world where a 2% margin is what's dictated, all of those things are going to be the things that push those high-risk middle performers into a fatality land. But I think it's important to acknowledge how we're doing. If we are one of the ones doing well, what does that actually mean for our strategy moving forward? how do we drive our acceleration faster? How do we actually get bigger market share? Or on the flip side, if we're not doing so well, how do we invest in resetting our operating model? Or how do we really rationalize what it is we're doing and refocus on what we do really, really well? Because if your strategy is not aligned to both your current financial position and one of those 4 directions, you're probably going to struggle. I also wanted to highlight that we're not operating in a world where all things are equal. So one of the things I found really, really interesting when we looked into this data was that you can have very, very similar organizations performing very, very differently. So we looked at four organizations, and again, this is real data. So all 4 organizations have very similar purpose or vision statements. So some variation of engage positively with people with disability to enhance their lives or improve their quality of life or something along those lines. Words, people with disability, words like engage positively, improve, quality of life, all had some variation. All 4 of these organizations were established in either the 60s or the 70s, so they've been around for a long time. All of them provide SIL as their primary income source, but that most of them provide something else around the SIL. So be it support coordination or STA, SDA, CP. And they each operate in different states, but they only operate in a singular state. But what we can see here is that their financial results look totally different, which tells us that it's not revenue or size that actually determines whether your business is going to be successful. It's your strategic cost controls, it's your operating models, and it's your service design that are going to be the things that mean whether you are successful moving forward. We can see here our 2 positive organizations at the top in blue. Very different growth trajectories. So one had significant growth with a little bit of petering out. The other didn't have much growth at all. They actually went downhill on their growth, but they're still operating at a profit over the 3 years. Then you've got your bottom 2 who are not making any money, who both had quite sharp growth increases, but both are still losing quite a lot of money. We need to understand, what are these models doing? What are the organizations that are doing really, really well capitalizing on versus what are the organizations that are continuing to struggle? What is causing that struggle? How can we maybe do something a little bit different? I think this is really important for us to stop and pay attention to, again, real data. But we have organizations out there making a lot of money at the moment. There is good money to be made if we're being smart about it. Now, the question that I have, and again, if I was a journalist, there could be a really good story in here that plays to the all providers are dodgy and people are committing fraud and all those types of things. I don't buy that. I don't think that that is the reason. I think that there is definitely a layer within our sector of probably wrong claiming and not providing services in accordance with your schedule of support, but I don't think that they're intentional, and I think they're in the margins. But these organisations here, so 22 organisations have managed to make a profit in the NDIS 3 years running. That profit totals $319 million. You can see here that some organisations, there's one there that's made over $150 million. That's not to be sneezed at. But again, it's about thinking through what is your strategy? How do you make your strengths stronger? And how do you minimize your weaknesses? But we spent a fair bit of time talking about money. And what I want to highlight is that money isn't the only reason to change. So we know that in struggling cultures, the biggest problem isn't the chaos that's happening in the external environment. It's leaders pretending like the chaos isn't there. And how many of our leaders that we saw before in our earlier examples just tried to pretend that things were going to be fine? You are big screen TVs. As leaders in the disability sector, you are big screen TVs, and everything that you do is amplified. Your staff see it. Every time you take that little second pause before making an announcement, every time you make a different decision to what you were indicating you were going to do before, your staff are questioning it. They want to know, are you going to keep saying everything's all fine? Or when are you actually going to stop and do something real? A positive attitude in this space doesn't mean spin. It doesn't mean coming out and saying everything's all good. A positive attitude is saying, yeah, we work in a really difficult sector and this is really hard and no one has all the right answers. But I know I work with a really smart bunch of people that can help us get a little bit closer to those answers. This isn't just feel-good stuff. Gallup's done a whole bunch of studies that show when your team feel like they can trust in their leader, they are 4.5 times more likely to be engaged, and they are 62% less likely to get burnt out. That is far greater than those who just feel like their leaders communicate effectively with them. You can't buy trust, but trust improves your business drastically. So, we've talked a lot about problems. We've talked a lot about how some organizations are doing some things well and they're doing amazing in this sector, and then other organizations maybe not so much. And at this point of our data analysis, I can't give you the reasons why some are doing so well and some aren't. We don't have access to the inner workings of those organizations to understand what are those key little things. But here's some things that we know do work. So here's some takeaways for each of you to go back to your business and think, how do I look at this differently? How do I take on the next 4 years of a Labor government who are going to be trying to tighten the screws on what they're spending? They're going to be continuing with a rhetoric of providers not doing the right thing, which probably means more providers are going to be taken to court. How do we make sure that we continue to do the good that we know we're doing for our participants, but actually make it publicly known and allow ourselves the financial security to keep doing it? So, your protection mechanisms. Embrace radical uncertainty. So we know this space, right from the who knows what legislation is going to get announced tomorrow, down to is the auditor that I've got booked in to come next week going to think that you must report all reportable incidents within 24 hours, even though some say it needs to be 5 days. And I'm using that as a real example because it happened to me. We've got variability left, right, and center. Wherever you look, you may have 2 participants who present very similarly, and you can find hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of difference in their plans. This is going to continue to be a volatile operating environment. So you must build flexibility into your models. You mustn't assume anything that's current is going to be there long term. I'm a firm believer that in this current climate, if you've got a strategic plan that goes for anything longer than 12 months, you're actually probably not being very strategic. because too much is going to continue to change. Yes, you need to know where you want to be in the long term, but at the moment, I think that's survival. And then you need to understand, how are you flexible? How can you change your model? How can you change your services? How can you adapt to different types of billing and rostering? Our next one is, what is your competitive advantage? So I've talked a lot today about what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Have a really deep dive into what do those things look like in terms of your service quality, the participant experience, your physical workspaces, and by that I also mean your online systems that people engage with, and how do your staff compare? Because they're the things that are actually going to be what drives you forward with your competitive advantage. If you can put your hand on your heart and know that your staff are better than anybody else's because you invest in training, that becomes your platform moving forward. What you've got to think about, though, is where are your competitors going to outpace you if something changes? So where are they already ahead of you, and what would cause them to get further ahead? Finally, pressure test decisions. So I know you're all probably doing this in your head anyway, and that as leaders in this really crazy sector, you're probably not getting a whole lot of really good sleep because you're questioning all these different things. But bring in other people. Before investing in new services or expanding or bringing in new cohorts, ask yourself, what makes this unviable? Why is this a bad idea? And keep remembering that growth in this sector at the moment is not the goal. Growth for growth's sake without actually looking at the viability that sits behind the growth is only going to cause you more harm than good. If you are planning on adjusting your services or where you operate or your participant cohorts, what are your exit points? When are you going to make the decisions that say, this isn't going the way that we thought it would? I'm not the gambler that's going to keep chasing my losses. I can still get out of this without having any harm done. So plan your exit ramps. Understand the regulatory focus. So the Labor government's been really clear. They are going to tighten scrutiny on restricted practices. I think I've seen upwards of about 15 different letters go to providers in the last few months over restricted practices. They keep telling us that we've got to stop doing them, we've got to reduce them. Not a lot of guidance on how or how the administrative supports are going to actually help us do it, but it's a very clear message. You will get smacked if you do not conform. If you do not meet the requirements of restricted practices at the moment, you're going to get a pretty hefty fine. We also know that they're talking very highly about participant rights and co-design. What that means for us in terms of service provision is that those things are going to take the highlight. Now, again, I know that the people in this webinar right now are values-driven providers. I know that we're not intentionally trying to breach anyone's human rights, but I also know that when providing a service to a lot of different people with a lot of different needs, and you're using and I say this knowing that they're not, but if you're using an unskilled workforce, things can get really hard to manage that quality on a daily basis. And finally, financial viability. And by financial viability, I mean of the scheme, not of providers. So they're going to be looking at how do they reduce their cost. So they've got their cap sitting at 8%. They've managed to bring it back to about 12% at the moment, but we know more cuts are coming. We know participants are not going to get the same as what they got before. So this is where I think there's a really great opportunity for some forward-thinking service providers to look at how do we deliver outcomes at a fraction of the cost? What does that look like in terms of our supports and services? How do we actually use our support teams to our greater advantage? I know for a fact that if you're providing SIL, the number of staff that are sitting around on their phones or sitting on computers doing admin because the participants chose to disengage, that's valuable time that you're paying for that we can use to create better outcomes for people. We just need to think differently about what are the resources we have and how we use them. And then our last one on the list is verifying quality. So again, most service providers will have some nod to we provide a high quality service, but very few can actually put evidence behind that. What does a high quality service actually look like? How do you verify that you actually have one and that all your participants agree? Because to be honest, your service quality is going to be one of the strongest protections you have in this volatile environment. It's going to be the thing that keeps people, that makes people want to stay with you, both your staff and your participants. I think this has been a bit doom and gloom, but I don't want it to be, because I think as a sector, we've got some really positive things happening out there at the moment. We're including people in co-design. We're seeing shifts. We're designing better services for individuals. But I think we've got to really look at how we do things differently. If you are a small to medium-sized provider, how can you actually look at sharing resources with other providers so that you can both thrive? I think one of the things that looking at all the data has shown me is that this is a really big pie and there's enough for everybody to have a slice. But those that actually really define what is our service, what is it that we do well, and how do we target that niche market are the ones that do a lot better. So you're not in this alone. We're all in this together. Having those minor shifts in perspective are going to be the things that really rapidly increase your progress. And the starting point of this is your strategic plan. Your strategic plan is the thing that is going to corral your troops and make sure that everybody's going in the same direction. It's the thing that's going to actually allow them to improve their trust in you as a leader and your organisation and what it's hoping to achieve. Finally, look, when you're lost in the storm, sometimes you just need a fresh set of eyes to see the path you've missed. When you are in the daily grind and you are constantly dealing with the next crisis of, okay, we don't have enough staff at this site, we've got financial issues over here, we've got this particular reportable incident over there, we've had pipes blow out of this house. That is a lot of balls to juggle, and it's sometimes really hard both from a time as well as a brain capacity lens to actually work out, what do I need to do different? Don't reach for another Band-Aid. Don't hope that another 12 months things will be different or the government's finally going to come in and realise how silly they've been and save service providers. We provide you with a really quick, cheap, effective diagnostic. So we look at your systems. We look at where are you spending your money? Where are you getting value for that money? Where are you leaking funds that you maybe don't even know? Could you survive a 30-day cash flow pause while they do a manual review? Could you survive if they implemented new structures and practice standards around how you need to operate in a SIL environment? Could you survive if they changed the training requirements for our front line? You want to be able to know that you can tackle each of those changes, and we can help you with that. Again, this isn't designed to be a sales pitch, because I think most of you have the skill and the knowledge of your business to be able to do this, but sometimes it's easier to body double with someone. It's easier to get someone to come in with fresh eyes and to just have that chat. And what we always find whenever we do this is people will always say, yeah, I knew I had a problem there. I just didn't know quite what it was or how big it was. And again, we have a money back guarantee on this. So if we don't find you an opportunity to save 10 times what our fee is, we give you your money back. So what have you got to lose except for change and dealing with that discomfort of change? And finally, come back again in 2 weeks' time, because we are doing our next installment. So what we're going to be doing over the next 2 months is taking you on a bit of a journey for how you can actually reframe your strategic planning and your operational management. We want to help you to give you some tools to make this a little bit easier, to think outside of the box just that little bit differently. So on Tuesday, we'll be sending out our next blog post, which is titled, Who Has a Seat at Your NDIS Strategic Table? I want you to think about who has the right types of expertise, who has the right experiences to map how you get through the next 12 months. What does that look like for your organization? Not the organization down the road, not the comparable one that's over in the next suburb. You. What is it that you value? What is it that you're really good at? And who's going to help you to get there? The key takeaway, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten, and that may not be a good thing moving forward. So we've got about 2 minutes, and I know that a couple of people have put some things in the chat, so I just want to quickly jump onto those and make sure that I'm not missing any key points. So if anybody's got any questions, feel free to jump on right now. Okay, Marita asks, will the slides be made available? Hi, Marita. We will make available a portion of the slides so that you can sort of capture some of the key information, but some of the financial data we'll just be keeping back. Then we've got, okay, Kerry said the key takeaways: embrace radical uncertainty, identify your organization's competitive advantage and pressure test, and focus on financial viability. And then Craig said, isn't a high quality service provider a provider that provides data to back up their claims of an improved function? Craig, I agree with you, but that's not been my experience. I think when you're talking about an intangible element like quality, particularly quality of service provision, where what's good service provision to one person may look totally different to another, I think that can often be really difficult to demonstrate that claim. What we've seen when we've gone in and done audits with our lived experience advisors is a lot of participants, particularly those living in SIL, will not necessarily understand what good looks like. So when you do your annual service surveys and participant feedback sessions and all those types of things, and you ask the question, we find when you first ask the question, it's generally a positive. Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, I'm happy, because they don't know what else is available to them. They don't know what good could really look like for them. If good is simply just the staff help me get my breakfast in the morning and then leave me alone for the rest of the day so I can play on my Xbox, when you don't know that there's a big wide world out there with all these wonderful opportunities for you, you are going to say good. So I do think that as a sector, we do need to innovate and look differently at how do we measure quality? How do we actually capture the participant's experience and the participant's life exposure? Because until we do all those things, we're just an expensive babysitting service. And on that note, knowing that that's probably a fairly big kaboom moment that people are going to argue with, and I totally agree, but I do think that we've got to address some of these holes in the way that we provide service at the moment. But thank you very much for joining me here today. I hope you've been able to take something out of it. Think about what is your unique perspective. What is it that you do really well that you think you can turn into a competitive advantage? Because that's where we're really going to start to survive and thrive. Have a great afternoon, everybody.